I work as an independent salesman, traveling across the country to close deals. It's a job that pays well if you know how to hustle, but it takes a lot out of you. You spend days on the road, barely sleep, eat poorly, and are always away from home. My home is in Topeka, Kansas, but I don't spend much time there. My wife, as much as she complains, understands. She knows this is how we put food on the table and pay the bills. We have 2 kids, a teenage boy who's always on his video games, and a 7-year-old girl who loves to draw. They're the reason I do what I do. That day, I was driving back from a trip to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Route 66 is almost like a second home to me. I know every stop, every rundown diner, and every roadside motel. I was exhausted. I'd left early and driven for hours without stopping, trying to make it to Oklahoma City before the day ended. But it was early October, and the sun was starting to set, painting the sky that orange hue that only looks beautiful if you're not the one driving. I needed rest. I couldn't go on any longer. That's when I saw the flickering neon sign by the road. Desert View Motel, next exit. The sign looked old with some letters half lit, but it worked. I knew it was one of those cheap, no-frills places, but that was exactly what I needed. I took the exit and followed the dirt road until I reached the building. It was a simple structure, one story, shaped like an L. There were about 5 or 6 numbered doors for rooms and a tiny reception area in the corner. The place seemed empty, except for one car parked in front of one of the rooms. I thought nothing of it. These roadside motels aren't usually busy. I parked my car in front of the reception, grabbed my backpack, and walked in. The reception area was dimly lit, with a single flickering fluorescent bulb. A man was behind the counter, a skinny guy with glasses who looked like he'd seen better days. He looked at me, uninterested, and asked if I needed a room. I said yes, just for one night. He grabbed a key from a hook on the wall and handed it to me, saying it was for room 4. He didn't ask for an ID or anything, just told me to pay $40 in cash. I thought it was odd, but I was too tired to care. I left the cash on the counter and headed to the room. The room was exactly what I expected, small with a creaky double bed, a bathroom with stained tiles, and a tube TV that barely worked. But at least it was clean. I tossed my backpack on the chair next to the bed and collapsed onto the mattress. Before sleeping, I sent my wife a quick message letting her know I was okay and would be back on the road early the next day. She replied quickly with a, "Good night, love you." That was the last normal thing about that day. I must have passed out for about 2 hours before I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. It didn't immediately bother me. I figured it was someone walking to or from one of the other rooms. The sound was uneven, like the person was walking slowly, almost dragging their feet. I stayed in bed, waiting for the noise to stop, but the footsteps continued. They went back and forth right in front of my room. I was tired, but not tired enough to ignore it. I got up and went to the door. I looked through the peephole but didn't see anything. The hallway was empty. I figured maybe it was a drunk guest or something like that. I went back to bed and tried to sleep. That's when I heard the noise coming from the room next door. It was room 5, and it sounded like someone was dragging furniture inside. The noise was loud, like they were pushing a chair or table across the floor. Now that really annoyed me. Who does that in the middle of the night? I got up again, opened my door, and walked over to room 5. I knocked. Not too hard, but enough for the person to know they were being loud. No one answered. I knocked again, this time harder. Still nothing. The noise had stopped, but there was no sign that anyone was inside. I went back to my room, still irritated, but trying to forget about it. I threw myself on the bed, determined to ignore any noise and get some sleep. And for a while it worked. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to an even stranger sound. It sounded like crying. Not loud crying, but soft, muffled sobbing, like someone trying not to be heard. The sound was coming once again from room 5. This time I was scared. What was going on in there? I grabbed my phone and called the reception, but no one answered. I looked out my window and saw that the car that had been parked earlier was gone. The place now looked completely empty. I sat on the bed, unsure of what to do. The crying continued, but I didn't have the courage to go back to room 5. I decided to wait until morning. When the sun started to rise, I grabbed my things and left the room as quickly as I could. I didn't want to stay there any longer. I went straight to the reception, but it was closed. The door was locked and the counter was empty. Strange, but not my problem. I left the key in a small wooden box by the door that said, "Return here," and headed to my car. As I was putting my backpack in the back seat, a man appeared. He was wearing a mechanic's uniform with the name Roy stitched on the shirt. He asked if I needed any help, and I said no, I was just leaving. Then he looked at the motel and asked, "Did you spend the night there?" I did. "Why?" I replied, confused. He laughed, but not in a friendly way. "That place has been closed for 5 years, buddy." I stood there staring at him, not understanding. I explained that I'd checked in the night before, that I'd seen the man at the reception, and that I'd paid $40. He shook his head like he couldn't believe what I was saying. "There's no one here. They shut it down after a fire in room 5, killed a man in there. They never found out who did it." My head was spinning. I told him I'd heard noises in room 5, footsteps, furniture being dragged, and he just gave me a look like he didn't know what to say. I left without looking back, but that story hasn't left my mind. I still think about it, especially on nights when I'm alone on the road. Whatever happened in that room, whatever I heard doesn't make sense, and I'd rather not try to understand it. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, but I've been living in Sun Prairie, a small town about 20 minutes away, for a few years now. It's not a very busy place, but it's quiet and has everything I need. I work at an auto parts store near Highway 19, so my routine is basically home, work, and sometimes a trip to the bar with a few friends. I'm not into big luxuries. I live in a small apartment on the second floor of a building that overlooks a wheat field just down the corner. Life here is simple, and I like it that way. That day I had worked until 6 in the evening, sorting out some deliveries that needed to be shipped. It wasn't anything too demanding, but it had been a long day. I decided that after work I'd take a drive to clear my head. I always do that when I want to relax. I take the country road that cuts through town and heads toward Columbus. There's not much traffic there. The night was cold, typical of fall in Wisconsin. The sky was clear, and the moonlight was bright enough to outline the fields in the distance. I passed a few isolated houses with porch lights on, but most of the road was just darkness and trees. It was around 8 p.m., and the car radio was playing a classic rock station. I remember that because Hotel California started playing right when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a mistake, one of those things you catch out of the corner of your eye and think, "That can't be right." But as I got closer, I was sure. It was a girl sitting on the shoulder of the road, her arms crossed over her knees. She had her head down like she was crying, but I couldn't be sure. What really caught my attention was her outfit. It looked like something my grandmother would wear in an old photo. A light blue dress with a white collar, completely out of place. My instinct was to stop the car. I didn't think twice. I slowed down and pulled over about 30 feet ahead of where she was. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. My plan was to ask if she needed help or if she was lost. But when I got out of the car and walked toward where she had been, she was gone. Just gone. I looked around trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe she had run to the other side of the road or down into the ditch. But there was no one, no sign of her. I looked out at the open field to the right, but it was just tall grass. The left side had a barbed wire fence and some more trees. There was no way anyone could have disappeared that quickly. I stood there for a few minutes trying to process what had just happened. I went back to the car, feeling uneasy, and decided to keep driving. But from that moment on, the road that used to calm me felt different, like something was wrong. I got home around 9. I tossed my keys on the kitchen table, took off my shoes, and sat on the couch for a while. The image of the girl on the side of the road wouldn't leave my mind. I decided not to tell anyone. I mean, what would I say? That I saw a girl sitting by the road and then she vanished? I'd sound crazy. I thought about calling the sheriff or something, but there was no way to explain it without sounding ridiculous. The next morning, my routine was the same as always. I woke up at 7, had a quick coffee, and went to work. It wasn't until lunchtime, while I was scrolling through my phone, that something caught my attention. I was browsing Facebook, and a post in a local group popped up. It was an old newspaper clipping shared by someone who lived near the same road where I had seen the girl. The headline read, "Fatal Accident on Local Highway Claims Young Woman's Life." The story was from 1978 and mentioned an accident on the same curve where I had stopped the night before. A 17-year-old girl named Elizabeth had lost control of her car and hit a pole. The detail that gave me chills was the description of her clothing, a light blue dress with a white collar. I read the article several times trying to absorb what it meant. It couldn't be a coincidence. The girl I saw on the road was wearing exactly what the article described. But how was that possible? Obviously, she couldn't have been there. She died decades ago. I tried to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. After work, I decided to go back to the road. I didn't really know what I was expecting to find, but I had to see the place again. I got there just before sunset and parked at the same spot where I had stopped the night before. The daylight made the place less eerie, but still, something felt off. I walked over to the shoulder and looked around the fields. The pole mentioned in the article was still there, rusty and with a piece of broken concrete at its base. While I was standing there, an older man driving a truck slowed down as he passed me. He rolled down his window and asked, "You okay there?" I told him I was fine, just looking around. He frowned like he didn't really get it. "You know there was a bad accident here, right?" I nodded and he continued, "My family's lived in this area for over 40 years. People always say you can see the girl sitting by the road sometimes. Some think it's just a story, but I've heard plenty of folks talk about it. Did you see anything?" I shook my head, saying no, but the truth is I wanted to tell him everything. I just couldn't. It didn't feel like something you tell a stranger on the side of the road. The man nodded and drove off, leaving the sound of his truck fading into the distance as I kept standing there. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I can't forget the image of the girl sitting by the road, her head down in that old-fashioned dress. I don't know if it was my imagination, if I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, or if it was just a reflection of something that happened a long time ago. What I do know is that since then, I've avoided that road at night. I don't want to risk seeing her again. Once was enough.